Welcome. Today is, according to the Romans, February 23rd, 2026. And I'm here with Paul Webster from basically northern England. Is that correct? Somewhere
Yeah,
up there?
yeah, that's
Okay.
correct.
And so we're going to get to meet Rob, and I'm not Rob, Paul, and Rob is who linked us up. We're going to meet Paul and have him tell us a bit about his rocky journey through the gauntlet of English law and give him
Yeah,
a context of what we do and where perhaps we have some common ground. We could work together and or assist Paul to have a more expanded context of how the law actually works. So I was just reading this brief summary that Rob sent me. Looks like you've been battling the system. You uh, did not pay your council tax. Now, is that council tax as in property tax, land tax?
yeah, but it's not really the context. I might as well just
Yeah,
give
yeah,
you a brief
go ahead.
briefing of my story. What it did, it was basically started over a property that I inherited, and when I remortgaged it, I put my then partner on the remortgage. We split up amicably, but she got in trouble and then decided that she wanted money from me to help her out, which I didn't have. So that was where she said, "Well, the house will have to go on the market." Well, I hadn't studied law or anything, but I thought, well, I can read. Let's go and have a look. And it was very simple to understand, to be fair, Ken, because over here we have Her Majesty's Courts and Tribunal Services. So if I want a service, I go and ask for that service. I don't have a service come and impose their services on me. So this just made too much sense. It was a civil matter between us two. If she sold her half of the property, whoever she sold it to, I would negotiate with. Are they moving in or are they just investing, whatever? Said, but there's no problem here. Until she sells it. And the first judge was fine, but then I got summoned again. And I thought, well, I'll just go and put it to bed. And I said, I'm not selling my property. I don't care what she does with hers, but I'm not selling mine. And the judge said, I'll sell the property and then I'll divide it. And I went, where do you get your authority over my property? 4 minutes later, Ken, I'm sat in the foyer of the courtroom. The double doors burst open, and 6 armed police run in, and they run past me and my friend, and they're running in and out of every courtroom like Scooby Doo it was. They were running about, and they didn't know what they were looking for.
Mhm.
And then the court clerk came out and called them over, and I looked over to my mate and I went, "They're for me." And then I'm summoned into the courtroom, and at this point, I'm a serving prison officer. And I'm escorted into a courtroom with 2 armed police in front of me, 2 behind me, and 1 either side of me in box formation for the sale of a house. I'm going,
Hmm.
what's going on here? I don't understand this. There's security that was baffled as well because, there was no shouting, no swearing, no nothing. Anyway, over the first 5 hearings, I had over 30 coppers present at my hearings with video evidence gatherers and all this kind. Couldn't work it out. Anyway, I fought that for 5 years, but in between all that, my court cases brought out utility fraud, gas, water, and electric, and what you said is council tax. It's what it turns out to be. It's a business rate. So if I open a shop, I have to pay business rates. At the back of my shop, I might have an outbuilding. Well, I may store things in that as part of my business. So they're not getting enough revenue. So council tax drops to the spur building where I may or may not keep stuff. So they get the business rates and then the council tax meant to bolster that. What I discovered, Ken, was over here we have land registry. So when I buy a house, I register it at land registry. Well, I was taught a certain way to do things for these processes. So when I registered it as Mr. Webster. Well, Mr., Miss, and Mrs. were all business titles. So under presumption of our civil law, they presume and deem all property in England to be commercial, at least capable. So what they do is they wrote to me all those years as the mister. So I'm a shopkeeper. They were presuming the shopkeeper, and I responded because I paid my bills. Because what I couldn't get my head around, Ken, was my mum was she ran businesses, worked 13 hours a day in her own business. My dad did long distance lorry driving, 6 nights on and 1 night off in those days, then 6 nights on. So I knew how hard they'd work, Ken, and they were paying gas, water, and electric, but they were also paying taxes. So because I now knew that we were in a debt-based economy, and everybody knows that we're creditors, yeah, I'm a creditor. Well, if debtors only pay, what does a creditor do? And my utility company sent me a bill, and at the bottom of the bill, what we had was called a joint gyro credit. So it's drawn on a third party. So it was a voucher basically to set off my bill, not pay it. But they were treating me as a customer and trying to also treat me as a creditor. So under the bills of exchange, it was a sign and date thing and give it them back. I'm happy to do that. But the reason I found this out, Ken, was because when they wanted to break into my property to force a pay-as-you-go meter on me, which is voluntary under their own rules, so I went to court and I said, look, to the magistrates, I said, are we here to talk about the payment of the bill, or are we here about a forced entry warrant? And the magistrate said, put her glasses on the end of the nose, and she says, look, Mr. Webster, have you got a bank statement to show that you've paid the bill? And I went, no, it's been settled under the bills of exchange. And she went, bills of exchange? And the legal clerk turned around and looked up at her and said, yes, ma'am, that's a legal remedy we don't deal with in this jurisdiction. I went, remedy? Did you just say remedy? I've brought a cure and you won't touch it. That's what I just heard in that room. So I knew that gas, water, and electric, for me being at home with no commerce around me, I should have been setting off and not paying all my life, and so should my mum. Because it's not a shop, Ken, council tax is not applicable, so I shouldn't be paying that either. And that is before we get onto mortgages. So from 2010 to 2016, my life completely unraveled because, you know, tongue in cheek, Ken, when I learned the bills of exchange, I used to tell people, hey, your gas is free, because nobody ever checks the bank account to see how much money they've been taken in tax. They just look at what's in and live in that means, right, out of that, I've got to pay this, and then I've got this left. Well, gas, water, electric shouldn't have been going out. So I thought people might call me an idiot, but they'll say, why would you say something so silly that it's free? Everybody's got to pay. Well, what do you think the taxes are doing? You know, you've employed this government to run our business, the national grid, because we took on all the debt. So we paid these to employ them, but we've employed somebody to run our shop, and then we've left, and they've started to take all the profits and run it like it's their shop. And we've no recourse because when we go into the courts, they don't recognise us. And the first radio show I went on, the Vinnie Eastwood show back in 2014, I said to him, the whole point to a county court hearing is so you can't be heard, because it's got to be on paper and they're only looking at what they're standing under. And if that's not rebutted, Ken, that was it. So it destroyed my entire life, and people who were like 15, 30-year friendships just disappeared because they thought I'd gone nuts, because it's so fantastical, isn't it? You're brought up and you're taught, you've got to pay your way, you've got to work, you've got to do this. And my mum said, I said to my mum when I was about 6 or 7, and I said, Mum, why, when I get older, why have I got to go and get a job? Because I'd rather play on my bike. And my mum said, well, you'll want to get married, you'll want to buy a house, you'll want to have kids, you'll want to go on holiday, you'll need a car. And I said, why? And she said, that's life. And then all of a sudden I'm sat there with that ringing in my ears and I'm going, you taught me gas, water, and electric you had to pay for, and it's wrong. It's the wrong thing to do in this economy under the legislation. And I'm like, how have they done this? So then obviously it relates down to where the birth certificate comes from and what that manipulation is and what this trust that we've had set up over here. and it's being able to declare myself as a live, living man who's got assets, and any agreements that you presume, well, you've got to show me where I physically come into this, because if it's based on presumption like council tax, then that should be easily cleaned up. But when we started our council tax case in 2019, we started at what they call the Valuations Office Agency, which is the office that decides how much your property should pay, how rateable it is. So from there, right to High Court, all the legislation that they tried to point us to, Ken, it was all commercial language. Everything was commercial. They couldn't get away from it. So COVID kicked off, and we had to do the High Court hearings over Zoom meetings. And at the first hearing, all you saw was the opposition and the judge like this. And then on the second hearing, because he came up with something that he knew we'd have to go and appeal and we'd get it straight away. But it gave him 3 months, and he went back over all the documents. This judge was selected for us. And he went all the way back and found at the valuations office, our lead had used a term, and he'd used the word reside. Well, you can reside in a bed and breakfast, which is commercial, a residential, which is commercial, a hotel, which is commercial. So at this hearing, from being like that, he went like this. And all he said was, at this moment in time, your properties are capable of being commercial. I'm not listening to anything more. And he shut the case. So we knew we had them with this, and it is all based on commerce. And we know that they're actively defending that, because the judicial system that is used to steal all this money, it supports what we have called the Privy Council. Not many people are aware of what the Privy Council do, but they control everything. What they say goes. There's no monarchy that's telling these people what to do, and the government is certainly in their pockets, whereas we're employing the wrong people. In this country now, we've got the Labour and the Conservatives that have made the mess between them because they have an underlying agreement on a lot of policy. We argue about what they disagree on. But there's a migration replacement policy that's come into this country. And because of people paying these bills, that means the money that they take in income tax, they spend it. Well, they send me a receipt so they can balance the books. But because everybody pays, they can't balance the creditors' books. So they have to increase the prices on the debtors' books, which is everybody, to balance a book that you can never balance. So it's complete, it's accounting fraud at the very least. And all of this is joint enterprise. So when you sat in the middle of that in 2016, Ken, and then you're on a caravan floor and you're 18 pints of lager in, and you're going, I don't want to be here anymore. Because if all this is a lie, what else is there? And that was it, honestly. Then, because before I started the legal stuff, and me and my ex-missus split up, I started to live life again. But there was one thing that had always stuck with me. Back when I was 16, my dad was killed. And all my life, I'd known there was something after this life somewhere. I knew there was something after it, but I didn't know what it was. I knew that all the religions weren't for me. I was never given a dogma of a religion. I was blessed with that. But the closest that I got was when I was doing mediumship, and I was getting images, and I would interpret, feel and discern them. And people would take the messages, and I didn't know where they were coming from, because they were very random stuff. But I had an understanding of them, and people took them. So, you just take life for what it is when you're dabbling about and trying to understand. But when there was nothing and I was bereft, there was nothing left for me. I'd just given up. I said, I'm done. And then when I did mediumship, I never heard spirit and I never saw spirit, but a voice woke me up 4:10 in the morning, said, it is done. And I just went, that was Jesus. And I have no idea why to this day. And I just sat up, but I couldn't get back to sleep. I went to jail, Ken. handed out toilet rolls at work all day, thinking about this. I come home, I thought, I'm going to read Revelation, I'm going to find out what it's all about. He has a very good sense of humour, God, and he turned it on me and he said, yeah, he's done that, she's done that, they've done that, Paul. You've had a really hard ride. Where's your responsibility in all this? I walked out on my wife and my child, Ken, because I thought the grass was greener. And it wasn't. And when I got there, I still had to mow the grass and I still had to paint the fence. And there was nothing better. You know, it was one of my biggest regrets, but I'm blessed that my ex-wife is still one of my best friends to this day. So I had a lot going on and it all culminated at that point. But from waking up and just saying, I'm going to go and read this Bible and starting to understand it for myself, not what other people have said, because what I found in that book, it goes against Catholicism, it goes against Church of England, it goes against Islam. All you've got to do is read it for yourself, which I hadn't done. And that was what I was really furious with myself about, Ken, because of all the bills of exchange and everything. I'd done my due diligence on everything. And yet here I am with an opinion on something that I've not read. That didn't make sense to me all of a sudden. So all what happened was a life-changing experience. But when you understand all this and then you start to connect it to not just the politics of our nation, but the geopolitics, you know, how the rise of Trump now and how people think that it's all part of a worldwide plan against globalism and how we're going to, it's all a massive melting pot. And I'm sat in here, Lee, in the north of England going, well, I've got free gas, but I can't, what am I there to do? What am I going to do about the world? And there's nothing you can do. So it came down, all I could do was carry on doing the talks. I mean, 10 years ago, if people had have come and just got that gas bill, because they were giving them out like confetti, these joint gyro checks, they were attached to the bottom of every bill. 2019, because we'd had some success, they stopped issuing them for utilities. So now you have to take the utility company into court and sue them for that remedy, where they don't want you to know about it. It was very strange to see courts acting the way it did, but it showed you the fraud.
Yeah, let me interrupt you 1 second. You just said a couple sentences ago that you don't pay your tax. So did they accept your presentment of the voucher ultimately?
It was the gas. No, we went to court. A guy in a boiler suit turned up with a letter for me that says we've all heard about these debt avoidance techniques gleaned from the internet, which I'd had off them 3 months before. The judge said, right, Mr. Webster, I'm going to give this bundle to him to take to his legal team. I'm adjourning for 56 days for you to come back and we'll sort it out then. 56 days later, they did the only thing that they could do, Ken, was not turn up. So I asked for summary judgment that I'd settled the bill and the judge wouldn't give it me. And I asked why. And he said, because you're defendant, you'd have to become claimant to get summary judgment. So that meant I had to sue a £3.4 billion profit-making company, whilst I had armed police called on me at court and everything. It was overwhelming. You know, I could see all this stuff. I needed people to understand it and take it on, help me. But whereas David Icke used to say, one man and his dog would turn up to his talks, I didn't even have the dog, mate. There's nobody coming because everybody pays bills. It's just, they couldn't break that spell. So what happened with British Gas was we got to a Mexican standoff. They left me alone. I left them alone.
So that's been the way ever since. And so you get your gas, but you don't pay the bill. Is that correct?
Well, there's no, we don't get anything.
Okay.
Don't get anything.
Yeah. They don't bill you and they still service you or provide the gas, correct?
Yeah. So, well, it's still hooked up.
So, are you in the original house and property you inherited, or what happened with that?
No, they sold it. This is how I found out at land registry. I went to land registry to find out how they sold my house, because I sat with somebody legally trained at that time. They don't do it anymore. And I sat with this lady and I said, look, how have you sold my house? I haven't signed anything. There's no signatures or anything to do this. And she said, all we need is a county court stamp. And I said,
Right.
I can go to a stationery shop this afternoon and have a county court stamp just made up. Can I
Mhm.
put my bundles in and you help me steal people's property? And
Mhm.
she says, it doesn't work like that. And I said, you're a paper clearing warehouse for the banks and judiciary to steal property, aren't you? And without breaking eye contact, she went, I can neither confirm nor deny that.
Mhm.
So that's how I found out, Ken. That's how I found out we were funding our own demise with taxes that aren't applicable to our property unless it's a certain type of property. But the biggest thing is in Section 3 of the Local Government Finance Act 1992, it states that there is no list, nor is there a list required to show any property to be exempt from non-domestic ratings. So commercial ratings, no list to show any property exempt, yet there must be property exempt, but if there's no list, there isn't any, they're all commercial, and that's what they run on. So it's just a lie, and this Babylon system has just been going so long, it's used to its own lies, and then idiots like myself come in there and start asking questions, and the next thing armed police are called, and all kinds of it was just unreal when they got the banks involved. I asked the bank, well, show me what you've lent me, show me a contract, show me the accounting, show me a bill of exchange. They can't do any of those. If they've got the deed and the note, they can at least ask for money. But if they sold the note and they've only got the deed, then there's no mortgage, it's been sold. So what are you asking money for? And
Mhm.
then people who I know always think that banks are lending money. And I said, no, banks can facilitate credit. So what they do is they facilitate a credit agreement between a debtor, you, and a creditor, you. You give them power of attorney to act as you, the creditor. So you basically lend yourself the credit, but you can't spend credit. So the bank, for a fee, converts that credit into cash and puts it into your account. And then over a 25-year mortgage, they don't take their fee until the end. So because you haven't paid them for 25 years, they charge you interest on that right to the end of the mortgage. That's why there's always this lump sum to pay. So everything that I based my life on right up to that point, Ken, was lies. It was just shot to pieces. And what can you do but expose this evil? It's what I'm like you, Ken. You've been doing it all these years. I've been doing this 15. I've always researched all different things. I knew what was going on in the world, but you just do life. But when life comes to you, puts you up against the wall and says, "We're going to take everything off you," and you're going to do nothing about it, and then you hear Klaus Schwab saying in Europe that you'll own nothing and be happy. Well, we don't own anything because of the way we register it. The way it's registered, nothing's private. It's all up for tenancy. So we're almost. I likened it after working 15 years with sex offenders. We were groomed into this by society, and we had the best groomers possible, which were our parents, who were also groomed. So we've got a lot of trauma to heal from. So that's why it was interesting. We might I don't know where we'd go on the spiritual aspect, but I can still understand the energies, what we're doing in the spiritual world with all that trauma. And then it comes back and it regurgitates. So if you're if what's playing out there is playing out here and it's trauma, then you end up in that whirlwind. But when, as you were saying, when you start to talk about love and doing good things for people and not having that pride and that type in it, then you start to see fruit. I think when Rob when Rob asked me, had I heard about PanTerra, I said, yeah, there used to be a great heavy metal band I used to be into, and then it's only the last couple of days that I kind of associate it. I'm not saying I associate you with her, but I remember years ago looking at a woman's work called Heather Tucci Jarrett. Do you remember her? I can't hear you.
Oh yeah, sorry. I put it on mute because I thought I was going to sneeze.
Oh,
Anyways, yes, yes, of course. Let me, well, go ahead and yes, I know about Heather, so go ahead
yeah.
and,
So it was that OPPT and
all
the
right.
UCC stuff, and I could, the fact that if we could apply the UCC onto our judicial system, it would hold them to account in somewhere. So that's why when Rob was talking to me, I associated it with that. But the way he was talking, it was, we could actually see fruit bearing. So that's why I was interested in speaking with you. To be fair, Ken.
Okay, well, let me ask you a couple of quick questions just to kind of fill in the context, and then I will respond to everything you said. Um, so, where do you live now? Do you have a house? Are you staying with other people or,
No, no, I was like I said, I've been on this journey, even though you don't see it at the time. I have had blessings. My best mate, who's a window cleaner, he says, I had no savings or anything, and they were evicting me. If I knew then what I know now, I possibly wouldn't have been evicted. I could have fought it off maybe, but they've made that much of a example of people who fought for the properties. They've got themselves in deep, and they can't go backwards now. They have to
Mhm.
go through with it.
Sure.
But me, another friend owned a lettings agency, and normally you've got to have time to be credit checked and everything, and he just vouched for me and put me straight in. So I probably slept on a couple of couches for a week, and
Hmm.
then I've moved into my own house. But all my stuff, I've had to move all my stuff out. A lot of it got thrown or sold because I didn't have the room to where I was moving to. I moved from a decent, over here at least, a decent 3-bed semi-detached to a mid-terrace, two up, two down. But it
Hmm.
it does me, Ken. It was the injustice. It
Sure.
was it was
Of
so
course.
it
Yeah,
was deeply hurtful.
sure. Of course. So when they sold the house by order of the judge, did you get half of the proceeds?
No, because the bank claimed I owed them £54,000. And when I brought case law
Mm.
before my judge, which was the case law is Carlin Hughes versus Santander. And basically, the High Court judge said, "Look, Santander, you're a very big building society, but I can't take your word that this man owes you money. You've got to evidence that he owes you money." Well, that case law, my judge picked it up, turned it upside down, put a hand on top of it, and said, "I can't see that. I take the bank's word that you owe them money."
Hmm. Wow. So was that a mortgage that your mother had before she passed away and passed it on to you?
The house was bought and paid for, but because it
Yeah.
needed modernising, I remortgaged so I
Yeah.
could do it up.
Okay. All
But
right.
all the payments were being made. The mortgage wasn't an issue. It was
Sure.
that the judge was selling it. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. Well, yeah, and he could sell it or have it be sold at any amount. And it sounds like what he did was set the sale price at what would satisfy the bank and took care of the bank as a first claimant, first
Well, he
position.
sold it for they sold it for 98,000.
Hmm.
The bank took 54 of that they
Yeah.
weren't entitled to,
Hmm.
and she got 19. I should have got 19, but I paid for the privilege, so I only got 11.
Okay. And that's long gone anyways, right? So then the other question before I want to put some context around your story. When you had your job before all this started, you were a prison officer, correct?
Yes.
So have you explored within yourself sort of the juxtaposition of being in the prison system as an officer who guarded and warded the prisons versus your experience after that? You lost your job. And so, did that at any point kind of hit you in the face like, oh, I was guarding prisoners, some of whom did do bad things, however we define it, but a lot of them may have been in there for commercial crimes, things like that. Did you ever kind of, with whomever you interacted with in the prison, the prisoners, did any of that kind of strike you as kind of a paradox that you had to face within yourself?
Um, that I was handing toilet rolls to the wrong prisoners, because the worst criminals I ever met was solicitors and judges.
Right. That's
I
basically
did.
kind of what I'm saying.
Yeah, I was forced out of my job because of COVID. Because of the armed police, it left me, after a bit of a breakdown, it left me with panic attacks.
Mhm.
And during COVID, they wanted people to wear masks. But because there was no risk assessment, because everybody really knew there was no real risk, but they wanted people to wear masks, and you could wear them under your chin, Ken, just as long as you wore them. Now, that's conditioning. There was no need for me to wear one if that's okay. But I was constantly stopped. And because it was an authority doing something to me I had no control over, it was the PTSD that was building up. So by the time they said, because in the end, they forced me to prove my disability by getting a doctor's letter. 2 weeks later, I was under a full investigation for being a sexist, racist, homophobe. You can't make worse allegations. Now,
Mhm.
they were taken away because there was nothing there, but I wasn't coping by that point. Now, because of the what we have over here is the health and safety executive, if there's an issue, there must be a risk assessment method statement made. So if I'm coming out from the outside, I'm going into a jail of 1,500 people, deadly pandemic, 500,000 people were being told he's going to die, and I'm going in there with no mask. Right, we've got to do a risk assessment and see where we can put Paul Webster, what job he can do. They didn't do that. Why? Because there was no people wanting a risk assessment. It was our local senior management who wanted to look good and pat themselves on the back. And I was an issue because I'm Paul Webster. I stand up for myself, whereas all the others, certainly around me, were just complying. So that's what put me out of my job. I couldn't take this to court myself, Ken, because I knew I had them with the health and safety, and I got a solicitor who do a no win, no fee at what we call ACAS, which is a preliminary court hearing. And the Secretary of State barrister said at ACAS that Mr. Webster's case has no merit, but what a big word. What does he want? And we ended up with an out of court settlement that I've been living off for the last few years. But I had to sign on for benefits last year because I'm getting into that position, because the CPTSD, it took me 7 years to heal, Ken, from armed police. And then this was my job. Now, my job was my lifesaver. It's the best, easiest job I've ever had in my life. I loved it. I was good at it. The management was awful, but the job, prisoners are prisoners. They never change, Ken. So what if you're just a decent bloke who'll give them what they're entitled to, and deal with everything else, you don't have any issues. 15 years, I never drew me baton in anger or had a fight with a prisoner due to me. It was the job for me, and that saved me, I think, after the first breakdown. But then I had nothing, and there was nothing to hold on to. So the last 4 years have been horrendous. The spiritual attacks and then the panic attacks. There's days, Ken, where it took me an hour to walk out the front door.
Mhm.
Rob wouldn't have even met me at that talk, because I said to Carl, who organised the talk, I said, I didn't know I was going to be here, Carl, until I'd actually shut the front door behind me and I'd locked it, because the stuff that it's brought up, Ken, all these traumas. And the funny thing is, the two after I had this breakdown that I'm coming out of now, the therapists that I saw, they all bumped me up to what they call stage 4, which is one-to-one personal psychology. I didn't fall into that bracket because they class me as not being in trauma, because I don't want to kill myself. When I want to kill myself, they'll give me the help, and I'm like, this world is just evil, and what can I do? Well, I do the podcast every week with me mate Alex, where we try and draw all this stuff together, from the bills of exchange, and get a conversation going. It's not whether I'm right and you're wrong. I'm not interested in all that. Come and talk and let's have a conversation. Why do you believe what you believe? And I'll tell you what I believe, and let's throw it in the melting pot and see if we can do anything to stop this evil. I don't know what else to call it, mate, because it's so multi-level.
Right. Okay. And so yeah. So one more question I have is, so Rob met you at some sort of gathering, which I only have some sort of peripheral not understanding, but awareness of what that was. There was Andrew and Mark Devlin, I guess, were the
Yes.
leaders. So my question is, where are things at now in the community of people who are trying to bring forward knowledge and truth and how the system works? And and I'm assuming that you're part of that, or you're invited to speak and all of that. So can you just give me a brief summary of where things are at in England as far as the movement for what people call the truth movement, the freedom movement, et cetera? Is there any sort of cohesion between people who are coming together, like you just said? Let's support each other. Let's put differences on the table and discuss it. Because there are several major subjects that everybody is really having to face right now. Law is one of them. Connected to law is money and history, and connected to law, money, and
Yeah.
history is religion. So these are
Yeah.
the things that are used to keep people separate and more in conflict. It's classic Machiavellian divide and conquer. So where are things
Totally.
at now in England, are called the Isles, the Western Isles, as far as that? Are people coming together and cooperating and starting to do deep research and really come up with real answers, or is it still kind of conflictual and people kind of being uh, put against each other?
It's yes and no. It's yes and no. 10 years ago, nobody was interested, and the ones who were interested were very in-depth researchers and thinkers. Then there was a transition where we went to people where girls from Manchester were doing TikTok videos and just saying, just change your meters right and don't tell them because it's all free. Now that is just surefire way to go and throw yourself into the arms of Satan if you're going to do something silly like that, because people say that, but what do you mean by it?
Hmm.
Because when I said it, I have a backup. I want to tell you why you shouldn't pay them, why tongue in cheek it's free. Whereas we had people walking into courts, Ken, and they were standing in a county court saying, I'm a man. And the judge would look across at the opposition and say, he says he's a man. And they go, we agree. And then he said, well, I've no contract. And he said, he's no contract. And they go, no, we don't have a contract with him. And the judge would just said, how are you going to pay this bill? And now those two things that they knew have gone. They can't talk. This language, you've got to understand. You're using English, but it's not what you think you're saying. That's what I tried to tell people from 10 years ago. So I did. I've been all over this country in the last 10 years doing talks, on the podcast, on radio shows, and it's gained slow traction. I mean, my gas, water, electric video got released by accident because there was an issue on my YouTube channel. So it got re-released. From having 200 hits in 10 years, within 2 months, it's gone to 18, 19,000 because people are actively looking, but there's so many more um, deflectors,
Hmm.
especially the online ones, because now they're using algorithms and bots and everything. You don't know whether you're talking to people or not half the time.
Hmm.
But people are actually trying things, but they still want that quick. Where's that button? Where's that button
Yeah.
you press, Webby? Where do you press it? Make it all go away.
Here,
I,
here
I,
in
I, I truly believe, Ken, if people had got that check with me 10 years ago, we'd have changed things.
Sure. Well,
Now it's a little bit more difficult, but there's more people. I didn't have the numbers. There are more people, so that's why I'm not really involved in it. I always kept my circle quite small because we had some really big giants of thinkers that we got involved with, and we didn't want anybody to come in and spoil that. So we go to other groups and give them our ideas, but we'd often be rejected because it was their way was the best and the only way. And
Hmm.
sometimes people have got a way of having an argument. So they can have a really good argument for a mortgage, but you're not settling anything.
Right.
I'm not interested in arguing, Ken. Never gone into a court with an argument. I've only ever gone in with a remedy. And I've been dragged in there and they still won't accept the remedy. So,
Yeah.
this is where we're at. This is why we do the podcast, because everything, all those points you brought up then, that's what we talk about on the podcast for 2 hours.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, very good. Excuse me 1 minute. I've got a young feline here who is checking in to put some crunchies in his bowl. I will be
They
right
don't
back.
wait, do they?
No, they can't wait. Okay. Hang on 1 second. They may be little, but they're very uh, sure of their capacity. And so we have a little
Yeah, that's a
morning.
nice way of putting it.
Yeah.
That's a nice way of putting it. I'm surprised mine's not coming here and shouting at me yet.
Yeah. Well, we have a morning schedule here and we're past due. So, uh, okay. So anyways, all right. Now I would like to give you a framework to understand what has been happening in your life, what happens in what we call England, that they call the UK, they call Britain, and really the entire world system. And what I'm going to say will give you a lot of insight and clarity and really open up an understanding so you really can put in perspective, especially because you have such a lengthy experience with dealing with it, whether it's parliamentary bills and acts, court systems, council, rates, taxes, all of that. You've used the word commercial numerous times. So let's go into that and give you a context to really understand it. Okay. So first of all, my background very briefly is in 1988, for various reasons in the business I was in, I had to file bankruptcy. And as a result of that, what had happened before, because of the reasons for the bankruptcy, I had not had to pay taxes, income tax. So I was used to not paying income tax. And I told my accountant told me after I filed the bankruptcy, he said, well, all those loss carry forwards. I had a lot of losses, so they were carried forward and offset any tax obligation that might have been there. So he said, you're now going to have to pay taxes again because you have bankrupted the past structure. And I said, well, I'm used to not paying taxes, so I think I'm going to figure out how not to pay taxes. And he said, well, I don't recommend that. And I said, well, I'm going to go figure it out. So I also said, well, that's why you're fired. You're not my accountant anymore. And away I went, late 88, 89. So I started exploring first the tax system. And in 89, 90, 91, as you said, 10 years ago, there was hardly somebody out there that you could talk to. Most people were just going along with the program, but there were a few deep researchers. Well, this was the case in the US in the 80s, even in the 70s, 80s, of a very few very deep researchers, most of whom aren't even known by name anymore now, 40, 50 years later. But when I started finding a thread, unraveling it, it led me to these real original pioneers who opened up the study of law. And they were quite extraordinary men and women who were very intelligent and deep researchers. There was no internet. And in a lot of ways, that was good because there wasn't all this 10,000 or 100,000 opinions or people making money by selling a process or a product or a document or whatever that we have now. I mean, it's just this mass swamp of, confusion in a lot of ways. And so, but on the other hand, we didn't have the internet to find each other or connect. So we had to do it the old-fashioned way. Get in a car, drive 1,000 miles, go talk to somebody and find out what they knew and if they were somebody you could work with. So that's what I did in the first half of the 1990s. And I was fortunate enough to meet some of the true pioneers and trailblazers of the entire movement that exists now today. So I have gone through every layer, virtually every layer of the process, some of which you touched on in your story. And but there's a lot of things that because people started 5 years, 10 years, or 15 years ago, even 20 years ago, there's a lot of foundational elements of the knowledge and the understanding of how the structure, the system, and the history of it really works that most people don't have. And that's what PanTerra is all about. So 25, 26 years ago, my wife and I founded PanTerra to fill in what was missing. And what was missing in a lot of ways was a continuity and a community that was the foundation of that continuity. Because most people, like I'm sure you can relate to this, they'd find a piece and they'd go try to either research it, apply it, do something like what you did, using, on the billing the bottom half that essentially is a voucher as you understand it and return it and do that. That's something that 20, 25 years ago people called acceptance for value. But
Yeah,
they didn't even know what that really meant. Well, what's
I
the
know.
value? What
I
am I
know.
accepting? All those kind of things, all the commercial things. So in the about 97, 98, what emerged from the the basis or the foundation of what I've just described was going on like 30 years ago was what became known as the secured party creditor process. Have you heard of that?
No.
Okay, well, let me explain that. So it does get down to a matter of commerce, but commerce is not where the solution is. Commerce is where the bait and switch and basically the trap is. And what you, I'm sure, have experienced and is that this is like a multi-layered system of booby traps.
Mm.
And each is essentially a closed system. So I don't know if you recall from high school math what a closed system in mathematics is. Do you familiar with the term?
Yeah, I
Okay.
know compartmentalization.
Yeah, basically. But in math, and I'll explain it for people watching the video, a closed system simply says that whatever the units or digits, mathematical numbers that are in a closed system, any relationship between one or more of those digits or numbers has to come up with an end product that remains within the parameter of the closed system. So if you have a closed system, the numbers 1 through 9, you could add 1 plus 2 and it equals 3. 3 is in the closed system. You can add 3 plus 4, 7 is closed system. You can do 2 times 3 and it's in the closed system, 6, the product. 4 times 3 is 12. It's outside the closed system. Okay. You can't
Yeah,
use that function and the end product and stay within the closed system. So the legal system is designed of many layers of closed systems that have an internal logic to them. They seem logical and real, and they are, but it's not the whole system. And the way this is structured is to trap people into believing they have a solution or a remedy within any given whole system that they have been introduced to, or they have somebody who says, well, I'm an expert, I know how commerce works, or things like that. So, and I'll get into describing how commerce really works and how it fits as a closed system, pretty much close to the top. And there's
If I
much,
just interject there for a second, sorry, because you asked about prisoners and knowing this stuff. I had one corporate prisoner in properly, and he wasn't a barrister and he wasn't a solicitor. He was an in-between commercial lawyer. And I said to him, I said, so you know what a bill of exchange is? He says, of course I do. I says, what about negotiable instruments? He said, yeah. And I had described what's attached to the bottom of the paper bill. And he was in for tax fraud. Um, the his level of tax fraud, because everybody does it, he says, his level of tax fraud, they messed up. So the big boys cut them all loose and let them do their time in jail. When I told him about that instrument and about setting off that bill, he sat on his bed, Ken, and went, 30 years I've been in this job and I didn't understand, I didn't realise that.
yeah,
So
well,
that's how
see,
compartmentalised.
yeah, exactly. So he's trained in commercial law,
Yes.
and of course, you take the you take the legal profession. I mean, it's just like the medical profession. You have doctors whose entire speciality, or whatever, they're specialists in one little part of the body, but they don't understand how the whole body works. So they're able to analyze a dis-ease or an imbalance in their specialty section of the body, but they don't know how it interconnects with the rest of the body, whatever that is. You have an ear, nose, and throat specialist. He knows how the ear, nose, and throat work, but that's a very small part of the body. Does he know how the lymph system, the blood system, the liver system, all these things, how do they
Yeah.
relate? The legal system is set up in the exact same way.
Yeah.
So you
I
have
understand that.
corporate law, you have commercial law, you have tax law, you have tax fraud special, and you have subcategories of specialties. They're all closed systems. And so a legal mechanic is what I call them, AKA attorneys or lawyers. They generally know their specialty in law, but they don't know how the whole system works. So
No.
I've been in this 36 years, and one of my skills and levels of expertise is putting puzzles together, how an entire puzzle or how the synergy, for the example of the body, how does the whole body work as a whole system? In law, how does the whole system work? And if you don't understand how levels of jurisdiction and specifics in in legal structure, excuse me, and and the history of it and where the construction of it comes from, you could make a lot of money as an attorney or a barrister or solicitor as a specialist. But if you're a
Mm.
living man trying to figure out how the attachments to things like commerce, things like bills of exchange, things like all of this. How does this relate to what you attempted to do? Because what you attempted to do is stand as a living man as opposed to a commercial fiction or a fiction in law that is the person that they are adjudicating and settling commercial issues to, with, and against, whether that's a billing from a council rates for property tax or if it's gas and electric or what have you. They're dealing in a very closed system of commercial and legal and codified or statutory rules and construction that have nothing to do with you in court standing and declaring, I'm a living man or I'm a man. Now, sometimes
Mm.
you will get remedy with that. Most of the times you don't. And, I could literally talk to you for hours and days about all the things that were attempted over the last 30 to 40 years. And one of
I've
the,
seen many of them.
yeah. And so
Over the last 10.
let me tell you what I know because I lived through the process or the times. So in the 90s, as people started to have certain expertise in subject-specific areas in a closed system, whether it was court rules, court procedure,
Yeah.
tax law, the IRS, commercial, etc. They would figure something out and it would work within the closed system. And they would
Yes.
go up against the IRS for the tax issues, or they would go up against the court system or whatever the issue was. But primarily tax and judicial were the primary areas where the real bondage and the real control and the real sucking of our life force in the form of, like you said, when you were young, your mother said you have to get a job. You have to go to work. You got to get married. You have to have insurance and pay this and that and medical and you name it, and then have kids and send them to school and do it all over again. That there were people, usually the ones who really went full in were ones who had this story similar to yours or variation on the theme. They got whacked and
Yeah.
by the IRS or whatever, and they tried to figure it out. And a lot of them figured out a lot of things. So I have the advantage or the vantage point of living through and being fully immersed in it for over 35 years, watching these things happen. And what happened way back in the 90s, it still happens today. But what I was able to observe is that somebody would come up with a win, a remedy. They'd figure something out with the IRS, with the tax, or other things. People were trying to figure out trust and things like that, entities to use for operating in the system, things like that. And they would do a win, have a win, and they would have the case in their favor settled, and then they would go out and they would start teaching. And we didn't have the internet then, so people would circulate around, go from city to city and do seminars, 2 days, 3 days, sometimes a week. And they would teach what they learned by having a victory in what they applied of what they figured out in a closed system. And they would have hundreds of people attend every weekend. Okay. And they were charging what seemed relatively reasonable at the time, $200 to $500 per a seminar. Sometimes you'd pay a
Yeah.
thousand or more, 1,500. I've paid as much as $5,000 with really advanced teaching and teachers. But they'd go
Yeah.
around and they teach everybody this specific thing. But there was no continuity. You couldn't call that teacher next week on the phone and say, well, I don't understand this. Can you explain it? No, he's not available. He's doing the next weekend seminar.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And people came together and tried to help each other, and some were able to help each other, but a lot of people, I mean, in mass, hundreds of thousands of people were trying to get remedy. They would be going into court trying to apply what they learned in the seminar or multiple seminars. And what really happened is that the system, because the judges all get together once or twice a year and they cross-reference what's going on. They have people from on high come in and say, okay, now the people are figuring this out. This is how you deal with it. This is how you lure them in and have
I'm on
them,
one of them lists over here.
yeah, and lure them in and have them try what they think they know, but they don't know what exists outside of the closed system they're trying to apply. And so what would end up happening is people would do things that were technically a infraction, a misdemeanor, or a felony against the legal codified system, and they would end up having it flipped over. And all of a sudden, hundreds and thousands of people were applying what this one or two guys were successful with. Now they're being slammed and they're being indicted for criminal activity. And many went to jail. Many went to had to go on probation. Many got fined. They all lost whatever they were trying to defend, whether it was a house with a mortgage or a tax issue or whatever. So I have had the experience of watching that and interacting with it and doing, many, many things over the last 35 years. But I saw soon on that that it was basically a baited trap. And so I avoided being sucked into the court system and the prison system because I knew enough to see what was going on, but I was able to study it layer by layer by layer. And so we founded PanTerra 25 years ago to create a society with continuity so people could study and have the continuous access to both guidance, education, and materials to do and learn to do what needed to be done. So back to what is secured party creditor. This is the foundation of all of that exists out there in the world on the internet of commercial activity and so-called commercial solutions. So you mentioned Heather Tucci and OPPT, which stands for One People's something Trust.
Yeah.
I forget what the other P is. Um, but it was all based on commerce. It was all based on the Uniform Commercial Code. The
Yeah.
Uniform Commercial Code is based on Roman civil law, which is essentially, which is called in Latin lex mercatoria. It's basically the original maritime law dealing with commercial instruments or bills of exchange and what eventually became negotiable instruments of documentary drafts that were backed by something of value that would be exchanged for goods. Say, guy gets on a boat in Rome or Italy and sails to Greece, and he has a documentary draft called a bill of exchange that represents value that he can exchange for goods that he's going to put in his boat, take back to Italy. Well, that's the fundamental basis of commercial law and monetary function, monetary systems. So over the last 150 years, this has been codified into a universal system. In the United States, it's called the UCC or the Uniform Commercial Code. There's relationships internationally between central banks, banking systems, monetary issue out of a central bank, and other nation states that have the same thing of how bills of exchange and other documentary drafts can be exchanged and settled. So there's a matter of how does monetary issue get exchanged and settled. And ultimately, that's all controlled by the Vatican. What a surprise. Um, and there's two primary, um, we call them international laws, called UNIDROIT and UNCITRAL that control
Yeah.
international relationships between domestically issued commercial paper that basically is Uniform Commercial Code, which is basically the Lex Mercatoria under Roman civil law. So in the 90s, a couple of pioneers came out, and they were actually a couple of men, two or three men who were put in prison for trying to do things. So they had years to study the law. And they, quote unquote, figured this out that the whole thing got down to a relationship to what people call the straw man. And this is your alter ego or your transmitting utility of private commercial energy that comes onto the public that underwrites commercial paper,
Yeah.
aka monetary issue or bills of exchange or what have you, and that we are basically the true creditor, like you said. Okay, you said I'm the creditor and they're the
Yeah.
debtor. But see, this is a closed system that's got a trap in it. That's a booby trap. And I'm going to explain in a minute why it's a booby trap, why you never got real traction in what you were doing, and why you were basically, sideswiped or T-boned, like in a car accident where a car hit you on the side from left field, because you didn't really know how the system worked or how the layered structure of these closed systems actually are integrated into a whole. And so back to SPC, which stands for Secured Party Creditor. The basic rule was that I'm the living man, the person that is created by the act of registration of the birth, the live birth that gets converted to a record in the record system called vital statistics that has a county or a parish level up to a state level or a province level, up to the national level, up to the international level. It's basically a function and a process of creating a census of inventory of the human resource called the people that are going to be used as the underwriting value to collateralize or assuritize the instruments that are issued on the public side. So the public side is all fiction. The private is where life exists. We are
Yeah.
in flesh and blood living beings,
Yeah.
but we're attached to the public side of fiction through the structure that I'm going to explain to you. And so the theory in the secured party creditor process is I'm the living man. I am the creditor because it's my energy or my life force that underwrites the fiction and the commercial paper. So the straw man is something I can claim and take control over. And the way that was done was various,
My
uh,
monopoly piece.
pardon?
It's my monopoly
Yeah,
piece to play
you're
monopoly.
the little doggy who's going around the circles, or you're the little race car or whatever. But not you. You're the player
Yes.
who is attached to
Yeah.
that little monopoly piece running around the board, trying to get pieces of paper and getting deeds to property and being able to be a landlord to charge, people rent and all that. So, uh, so in the SPC process, we would uh, claim and do various documents, claim the right to be the secured party as the creditor against all the value that was held by and attached to the debtor, which was what people called back then the straw man, and many people still call it the straw man today, which is a misnomer and it's another bait and switch. It's another closed system. It's not actually real. And I can speak of that quite authoritatively because I did the secured party creditor process 4 different times. I did it in 1998, 99 when it first came out because the men who brought it out of prison when they finally got out and they started teaching the other leaders, those were my teachers and my mentors, the people who were on the front line. So I did it when it first came out and I actually had success with it. Um, in say 99 through early 2000s. I did it again in the mid 2000s. I did it again in the late 2000s. I did it again in 2011. So I went through this 4 different times. I mastered the documentary process, the administrative process, and the non-judicial processes that were part of the SPC process and other things, all these things that you've mentioned that you tried or you've heard of, acceptance for value, whatever. So it's based on one fundamental principle, which is that in a UCC record or a documentary public notice / record, there are 3 component parts. There is a creditor, there is a debtor, and there is the collateral that underwrites the secured party's interest against the debtor.
Yeah.
So that if
Yeah.
the secured party does not get remedy or performance from the debtor, and that performance could be in the form of a car loan, monthly payment, a mortgage payment, whatever, then according to the contractual relationships and the rules of the Uniform Commercial Code, the secured party had the right to essentially foreclose against the collateral. And there are many things that come into play with that. There are, things such as what's called subrogation, which is a maritime insurance term. How does that work? I'm not going to go into it because that's take an hour to explain it. But
Yeah.
insurance and the underwriting of commercial vessels on the maritime seas of commerce all come into play. So insurance that underwrite and bond or bind the cargo. So back in Rome and Italy and Greece, the captain of the ship who takes a bill of exchange to Greece, exchanges that bill for goods, puts it in the hull of his ship, and then takes it back to Italy and he can sell it. Meanwhile, the manufacturer of those goods in Greece has a bill of exchange, and there's an interconnected relationship in the banking system where he can take that documentary draft bill of exchange and go get his local currency exchange for it. And so then he's made whole. The guy, the captain, takes the goods back home. He sells them, gets his local currency, and pays off the bill of exchange. And now it's a completed mercantile or commercial transaction. So the same thing was codified into the UCC, where there's a secured party, a creditor, a debtor, and the underwriting collateral that supports the claim or the contractual relationship between the secured party creditor and the debtor. So when they brought out the SPC, what we did is we filed a public record and many other documents, but the public record is called a UCC1. It's called a financing statement where you list the creditor, the debtor, and the collateral. And so, as I'm sure you know, many people watching this probably know, but many people don't, is that the debtor would be listed in the same thing that appears to be your name, the all capital letters name that was called a straw man, and that was the debtor, John Henry Doe. But then we would put our name as the creditor, John, and John Henry Doe's in all capital letters. John Henry Doe is in upper lowercase in the secured party or the creditor position on the UCC1. And we said, well, great. I'm now the secured party against the straw man, and I have all this claim, and I can do all these things against, the equity and the property that belongs to me as the superior claimant and all of that.
Yeah.
So now I'm going to issue bonds against the value that's held in the debtor position within the corporate entity called the United States or the United Kingdom or Spain or Mexico or whatever. And I'm going to issue those bonds, send them to the Treasury. And these bonds are denominated in $100 million units, and they're going to be on my secured account that I can use to offset and write bills of exchange or promissory notes as valid commercial instruments or negotiable instruments that I will then use to offset, pay, and settle and close a debt obligation, whether that's a utility
Yeah.
bill, a tax bill, a judgment order from a court, or whatever. The problem is that entity, the all capital letter name that's created by the registration of the birth record, the live birth record, and converted into a commercial accounting record in the system from local to state, province, national, international to the Vatican. That it is actually not a straw man. And I learned this after doing the secured party process 4 different times. And I did it with the absolute masters of the people who pioneered, did research, way more research than I could ever do. I mean, I could have, but I didn't want to spend all my time, 12 hours a day, studying all this law and going to the Library of Congress and National Archives. I studied the researchers, and I synthesized and integrated how I learned all the pieces and came up with a full integrated whole system of how it really works. And after I did my 4th round of the SBC process, one day somebody said to me, well, Ken, you've done all this process. It seems all valid. It seems all airtight and so forth, but you've just sent literally billions of dollars of bonded debt to the Treasury. And you've said that the bonded debt is attached to this thing you're calling the all cap name debtor on your UCC1. Well, do you know that you're in equity? You're the surety in maritime rules of international maritime and admiralty law. You're the surety that backs those bonds. So what you've just done is you've given the government through all these billions of dollars of bonds, and there was thousands of people doing it. You've given them documentary instruments that they control, because what you call the straw man is really a what's called a foreign situs trust, that they created a trust as an alter ego in a commercial legal construct. It's property of the parent entity, the bankrupt United States, that was put into bankruptcy reorganization in 1933 and has had numerous reorganizational plans over the decades, now almost 100 years. And then eventually all the nation states were put into bankruptcy and put into this one grand pile of bankrupt nation states with the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, and the Bank of International Settlements. So you've just given them, they don't have to write more Federal Reserve notes or Treasury bonds. You've just given them, all of you doing this, billions and trillions of bonds, and you are the bonded surety that is the guarantor of performance. So you've just dug yourself into a deeper hole of magnitudes of scale on thousands and hundreds of thousands, millions of levels of bonded debt that's on you as the surety. And you've done nothing except give the government the ability to then expand their off-book private monetary issue, to expand building the secret space program, the underground, military bases, everything. All you idiot so-called patriots who have been doing this SPC process, sending billions and trillions of dollars of bonds, you've just underwritten and funded the building of the global prison that everybody is in. How do you like that? I said, well, I don't like that very much. What's the real solution? The solution is not in commerce. The solution is in equity. Because if you're
Yes.
in commerce on the public side, it's all fiction. So no matter
Yeah.
how you write your name on the secured party creditor side, it's still a fiction in law. You've just reaffirmed that you're operating as a fictional character in their movie. Okay.
Yeah.
And you go into court and you say, I'm the living man, but the judge or the magistrate looks and goes, doesn't look that way to me. Looks like
Yeah.
you're the bonded surety with the obligation to fulfill the contractual agreement of settling this gas bill or this mortgage or whatever it is. And I own, this is the judge or magistrate, I own the debtor. You don't own the debtor.
Yeah.
You have no claim on the
Good.
debtor. We
Good.
created it. We gave you
Yeah.
license. You
We're
became
actually,
you became a driver in commerce to drive this commercial vessel on the Sea of Commerce when you applied to get a driver license to operate
yes.
a motor vehicle, aka a commercial vessel in commerce. And a license gives you permission to do something that is illegal to do. So you've been driving this vessel of the government, which is in bankruptcy, operating under the reorganizational rules of the creditor, the real creditors, the bankers, the banksters, the international, and who owns and controls them. And you think that you know what you're doing, but you don't. And so you've given all these bonds to the Treasury, which is really a district component of the International Monetary Fund, which was
Well,
given over. Hmm?
you asked earlier about the truth movement. Back in 13, 14 years ago, the truth movement gained traction. There were those giants. Like I said, I was standing on the shoulders of giants, people who'd known researchers from the 90s, from the 80s, some of them.
Hmm.
So we already established something. We were meeting in a pub in Liverpool at the time, and the people that were coming there were real in-depth researchers and
Yeah, well,
thinkers.
of course.
But what we saw was, as that gained traction, it filled up. We started to get people who'd come in and they'd cause a bit of discontent. And then all of a sudden, that one group was all arguing with each other and they'd all just fizzle out. It was the
Sure.
divide and conquer
Yeah,
that
exactly.
they saw at every stage with us. Yeah.
But the other thing to know and understand is all those giants, as extraordinary as they were with what they brought forward and researched and put into structure and form and so forth, they didn't understand what I'm telling you now. And I've just
No,
started, so I'm going to finish it. They didn't understand how the system was really constructed. And almost all of them went to prison for a very long time. The man who I learned at the third time I did the SPC process, who was quite extraordinary, put all this stuff together. He was sentenced to, I think, 17 or 18 years in prison. Okay. Many people I studied with went to prison because they still didn't know underlying true foundational construction and principles that I did learn and figured out and worked with some people, but in large part put it together myself. And so the few people who were telling me, as long as you're in commerce, you're in a polarity called the debtor-creditor relationship. You may
Yes,
think you're
makes
the
sense.
creditor, but it's a loop that is piling more debt on you. And like I just said, giving the government on the private side the authority and capacity to build the entire world prison. That's what the so-called patriots did. They gave
Yeah,
them the fuel to the engine to the, rocket ship
yeah,
to perfect this world system. So, and unfortunately, there's thousands of people out there still promoting the same thing, that all you have to do is claim your birth certificate and do this and do that, go to court. The OPPT process was actually created by one of my first teachers, mentors, who I met in 96 and worked with for about a year and a half till he got arrested and sent to prison for 12 years. He did a full 12-year prison sentence for what he was doing. And what he was doing was absolutely brilliant. And he learned it or worked together with a group called the Montana Freemen. Have you ever heard of the Montana Freemen? Okay. Well,
no,
okay, well, look it up. I've not looked it up on the internet for decades. But this was something going on in the 90s. There was a couple of men that were extraordinarily intelligent, and they broke the code at so many levels. They put liens on the Secretary of the Treasury in the 90s and forced him to be removed from office. And they figured out how to do certain things in the Treasury and the monetary system and so forth. And there was people doing this left and right all through the mid to the late 90s because before the secured party process came out. And then they were called the Montana Freemen because they called themselves freemen, and they lived on something like an 80-acre piece of land in Montana. So this guy who was my mentor taught me all these things, and I was totally immersed in it. There's a history here that's never hardly been told that I've been first witness to in many, many ways during all those years. But that mentor of mine that I mentioned, who's connected to the Montana Freemen, he was using the documentary drafts, which are akin to the commercial negotiable paper that they were creating, that they were using to put liens on judges and, you know, government
yeah,
officers. Um, he used it in Seattle, Washington to buy to exchange as a bill of exchange a purchase of three brand new pickup trucks. And it worked. The dealer gave him those three trucks. But when the dealer went to process it and went all the way through the system back to the Treasury, special Treasury agents came in and said, no, this is technically, it may be technically correct at one level, but ultimately it is a fraudulent instrument. And so we need you to file a criminal charge, blah, blah, blah. And they arrested this man who went and did 12 years in prison from like 98 to 2010. Then he came out of prison and he formulated another setup that Heather Tucci and her people took up and named the OPPT and did the same thing and got a lot of people thrown in jail. In fact, Heather and her two or three other, cohorts, they all went to prison for 5 to 10 years. So this is the layered closed system and the way the booby traps are set. And it all fundamentally comes down to how the system really works. So it's based on how equity really works. It's based on the history of the what we call the British Isles. It's based on the fact that this dude called Norman from Normandy, called Norman the Conqueror, or not Norman, William of Normandy, the Conqueror, the Normans. And why were the
yeah,
Normans? They were the Northerners who came actually from the what we call Scandinavia, and came down and settled in the north uh, part of France, who were uh, intensely Catholic. So they basically were part of the Catholic origins. And there's a lot of history that I've studied quite extensively where that all comes from, going back into where religion and the construction of the Bible and many other things that are now inculcated and integrated into law in the world system, which I have to tell you is another bait and switch. It's another closed system with hooks and feeding tubes that are deeply embedded in that system. And I see a little bit of consternation on your face, but this is part of my work. And as you get into PanTerra and the work, the knowledge and the education, the information, a lot of which is now on on the internet. We have a new setup called Freedom Absolute, a YouTube channel and a Patreon and Substack, and a methodology for people to subscribe um, to Patreon and Substack for Freedom Absolute, and thereby enter into our online university and learn all of this because my approach has always been an entire, complete whole system. You know, I've studied religion to its roots, esoteric, law, monetary, history, all these things. It is all interconnected. So if you want to know who the Normans are in Normandy, northern France, you have to go to Scandinavia. If you go to Scandinavia, what we call Denmark or Holland or Netherlands, you have to know the history of where they came from. Well, they came up the center of Europe and they were the tribe of Dan. And where does the tribe of Dan come from? Well, they come from Egypt. And where does that come from? It comes from other things that go deeper into history in Sumeria and Egyptian, and the whole construct of the gods and the temples and the bankers and all the rest of it, which is all subject
13th,
for
the
another.
13th tribe, the 13th tribe that got divorced. Prince King Charles, sorry, now claims the bloodline goes back to the tribe of Dan. He claims to be direct descendant of Vlad the Impaler.
Yeah, of
So you're
course.
right. We've got
Yeah.
all this stuff has been put in place for this.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay. And it's the layers of the onion are so deep, and this
they
is what the
certainly
work,
are.
this is what my work is about. This is what PanTerra is about, and we can get into that a little bit at the end. But back to the subject at hand is that when William conquered essentially the city of London and took it over essentially as a Catholic um, hold on those isles, and those isles have a long history as well. But basically, what was instituted at that time and implemented over the next 20 years, 1066 to 1086, and then soon thereafter, you have the French aristocracy that came from the original Judea, Palestine, whatever you want to call it, went back to Jerusalem in the First Crusade, 1099. There's all these geopolitical structures and machinations and historical timelines that actually do all fit together. The ultimate
Mm.
goal, of course, is what the Pope issued in 1302, Unum Sanctum, which is, you know, the one unity or the sanctified claim that the Pope owns all the land, all the flesh, and all the souls. So everything that's been implemented in the last 700, 800 years was building that construct to claim the flesh, the souls, and of course in the land. Um, but in 1066, the foundation of that was set up for the second of what would become the Triple Crown or the three tiers of the tiara or tiers of that the Pope wears, the fish hat, which of
Mm.
course is Vatican City, City of London, and District of Columbia, the City of Washington.
Yeah.
And but the fundamental is that William issued something called the Domesday Book, or what people call the Doomsday Book, but it's called the Domesday, where he essentially had a census of taking all of the landholders, the landlords, the lords who had been granted the land or previously had claimed the land, controlled it as little warlords and so forth. But he needed to integrate that into a whole system of control of the land through the census or the taking of the tabulation of who was the lord of this land, what was his standing on the land, his claim of territory, his estate, and what did he have on estate? How many castles, buildings, serfs, everything that he had, and that was a taking of the census or the estates of those who ultimately were given lands of grant from the crown, authorized from the Vatican to have a landed estate and a title attached to the land that would become perpetual, that would become a sesta KV being defined as the duration of an estate held in patent by grant of land from the sovereign or the crown. And so that's all based on the Domesday Book and going forward. What they established from that period into the 1300s or 1200s, when King John in 1213 gave the Pope all lands, right, and title to his estate. Familiar with that? It's called the Holy Alliance in 1213, 2 years before
Yeah.
the so-called Magna Carta. And basically, so the papacy has owned the title to those lands, and those lands are basically called Britannia. So you have a Roman district called Britain or Britannia that is not the same as England or Angleterra, the land of the Angles that was established many centuries before. And but basically they were conquered. So in the rules of Roman war, a nature of a conquered estate becomes basically an estate under conquered territory in the rules that eventually became the rules of international law, the law of nations, the law of conquest, the laws of war. And everything is a matter of war. Okay, it's
Yeah.
all a matter of war and the rules of war. And the thing that was the biggest clue for me when I was very, very well experienced in commerce, I was doing, um, you know, affidavits of obligation, commercial, non-judicial, administrative processes for 15 years. The first time I did that was in 1996, all the way through 2012 and longer. So I had the experience of it, and the foundation of that was what everybody felt was this is it, maxims of commerce. And the maxims of commerce are like, workman is worthy of his hire. In other words, he owns his labor. And labor is something that can't be bonded as a commercial instrument. So if you're in true commerce, a workman is worthy of his labor. An affidavit in commerce stands as the truth. An affidavit unrebutted is sovereign in commerce. All these things underwrote all the commercial things that we all did and that you did. But there's a hook in there, just like there's a hook in everything they did over thousands of years. The hook
Yeah.
is what we thought was the solution or the remedy. And that hook said that he who leaves the field of battle first wins. So we would do non-judicial administrative processes. We would send whatever it was, a documentary draft, a bill of exchange, all these things that were established by the secured party process. And we had standing, we thought, to issue these bills of exchange and promissory notes to settle the public monetized debt obligation of the straw man or the debtor that we were supposedly the secured party against. And we would, but in order to perfect it, see, you never perfected any of your processes. You have to follow the rules of the UCC because you're dealing with commercial paper. Okay, you're dealing with the bills and utility bill or mortgage or whatever. In order to perfect a non-judicial administrative process, you have to follow the rules of UCC, which require three distinct steps that have to be a notice and demand that establishes the reasons for that. There has to then be a established period of time for response. A non-response puts the respondent into a status of fault, and you have to give them proper notice. You have to document that notice within the system, and that documented notice is a notice of fault with an opportunity to cure. This is why everything is in threes. This is why in the New Testament Peter had to deny Christ 3 times. This is why everything is 3 times. This is why in the Masonic system, the first 3 degrees are becoming like an entered apprentice, and the third one is a master, and that's why it's called, giving somebody the 3rd degree. You have to do something 3 times to lock in a contract that's based on thousands of years of the rules. And so you had to send the notice of fault and give them an opportunity to cure. When they didn't respond, you send them a notice of default. So now they've had notice, now they've had notice of fault, now they have a notice of default, and then you can perfect your lien claim against the dishonored commercial presentment. And if it's done properly, it does fit into the rules of bills of exchange and negotiable instruments, except the underlying problem is you don't have standing to do that because they own it all and you're dealing in their realm of fiction. You're not standing on the land. You have no standing to state a claim. You have no stake of claim on the land, which gets into land law and not commercial law, common law. And that gets back to landed estates. It gets back to the estates that were established in 1066 and 1086 with the Domesday Book. And the fundamental thing was a two-tiered system. The landed estates of the Sesta KV who had a perpetual hold of a title, whether that's Earl or Baron or Duke or Prince and so forth. Prince has a principality, a Duke has a duchy, Earl has an earldom, and a count has a county. They have a grant of land by the sovereign, by the crown, from the Vatican to the City of London to the titular holder or office holder, basically, of the throne and the crown. But that is a straw man. King Charles is nothing more than a straw man for the City of London, the corporation, and ultimately the Vatican. And that's why there's 3 city-states, DC, London, Vatican. It's all a matter of threes. It's all a matter of externalizing a principle of creation or universal principles and not the lower levels of law and jurisdiction. But essentially, with unum sanctum, the Pope claimed all the land. And he said, I'm going to create my global estate to claim all of the flesh and all of the souls and control the land, even though ultimately he knew and they know they don't have standing to claim the land either. But by the nature of contractual relationships, if you enter into a contract and you perform on that contract, see, people don't understand, for example, with a mortgage, you go to settle a mortgage, they issue a note. You're the creator of the note. You are indeed the one putting the commercial energy from the equitable interest held in your private estate. That is done by a banker or mortgage finance company. But it's all under license. You don't control the estate. And I'll explain that in a minute. But you sign that note, you put your transmitter of the private equitable interests and beneficial rights held by the estate, held by the executor, which is the state with all capital letters. You're a licensed driver in commerce. You're given limited authority as an authorized signatory to put your wedding signature on a document that gives it commercial energy underwritten by the underlying equitable energy or interest. So you sign a promissory note. They take 3 days, another thing of three. 72 hours. That's all hardwired with esoterica and numerology and many other things. So in the States, and I don't know how they do it over there, but in the States, you're given 3 days, 72 hours, what's called a right of rescission. You have the right to rescind your signature if you find a fault or a flaw or something that, basically fraud or whatever, but hardly anybody ever does that. They don't claim ownership of that note. So now in commerce, you've tendered that instrument, and under the rules of the UCC, the recipient of that now becomes the holder in due course. In commercial terms, the bank or the finance company now has received your tender. You've just paid for that property, that land, and more specifically, the title. They then take that, they go through the banking system, they take it to the central bank, the Reserve Bank, Federal Reserve, Bank of England, whatever, and that Reserve Bank monetizes it by issuing credit on a multiplication fractional reserve back to the banking institution that's licensed to do this. And it gives you one of those credits, keeps nine of them, and now they keep expanding the monetary system. But it's rooted in then the next contract that they issue that you sign in sequence in escrow, which is an agreement to be the debt servicer or the surety for that commercial paper called a mortgage. Like you
Yeah.
said, 25 years, 30 years, whatever it is, and you are basically now contracted in the domestic commercial monetary system to service that contract. Under the rules of that contract, you're given a deed of trust under a trusteeship of that deed. That deed is nothing more than the convergence of three component parts: a debtor, a creditor, and the collateral. The collateral is the title. The title is insured, and the debtor is the person that's on the title or the deed, and the debt servicer is the surety, the bonded surety that must perform on the public side of the obligations of the franchise, because it's not a straw man, it's a franchise. The franchise is created by the informing of the birth mother or father. In the UK, it's the father. In here in the States, it's the mother, but the function is the same. That when you register the birth, that biological parent is actually declaring by information the placement of this newborn, which is essentially considered to be a foundling. It has no true parentage because those parents are already bonded as wards of the state. So they are nothing more than legal guardians under a
Yeah.
ward guardian relationship. They're not
Yeah.
true parents. They're only legally guarding the trust relationship that they then inform to the state, and the state creates not a birth certificate, a record of birth called a record of vital statistics that goes, like I said, from the local to the state to the international or national, international. And now basically, the birth certificate that everybody touts, all I have to do is claim my birth certificate. But the birth
If
certificate
it was
is,
that easy, I would have done that
I
years ago.
know, and there's many people who've tried and it doesn't work because they have no standing. The birth certificate is a bond. Okay. So you have to understand the nature of bonds. Okay. Which of course is the root of the word bondage. Um, and a bond is essentially the evidence of a trust, whether public or private, that is essentially a debt obligation against that trust. So when you claim the birth certificate and say, "Oh, I have the birth certificate now, I can go to court and pay it," which is what the OPPT people did. That was another closed system bait and switch that they thought they could do that, and they all went to jail or
Yeah, and
lost their.
I know somebody years ago who sat in a courtroom and they said, "Is Mr. Smith here?" And they pushed a birth certificate forward and said, "That's Mr. Smith there." Now, they kept saying, "Is Mr. Smith here?" And in the end, because that's all he did, didn't have anything else other than that. He just found in absentia. Oh, he's not turned up. No, Mr. Smith. Right, we'll do it without you. And he
Yeah.
was sat there. So these traps have been there all along. When you were asking about how things have changed, we've just had in one case we had a woman who was driving without a license, and they'd got her they got her in court, but she wouldn't she wouldn't accept the name, the given name or anything like that. She said who she was, I'm the living person, and I'm a representative of that, but that isn't me. She did all that kind of stuff. They kept her in the cells, must have been 18 hours, but then released her. And then they arrested her again, kept her, and then had to release her because there's nothing to hold her on. They're trying to get her to do that contract. They're
Yeah.
trying to get her that hold on
Sure.
her. So she did do something. Because they've had to walk away. I think the answer to your earlier question was the people that are getting involved now, even though they're not getting it right, they're clogging up the system to the point where the people who have got the articulation can now step in. I was speaking to a friend today. I've not spoke to him for 5 years. He was involved in a lot. Now he was trying to collapse the trust so that they would just leave him alone. He'd had enough. And what's happened was I only had a brief conversation with him today, but he's going to come on the podcast and explain what he did. What he's done is, if I explain it as he's blanked his sheet, he's got a completely blank canvas now. So that Monopoly piece, that little race car, he can now go to the council and say, "You've sent me a council tax bill. That now you now need to speak to the trustees." So everything's been directed back towards Parliament. The parliamentarians and Number 10 have wrote back to him as trustees, so he can engage in whatever he wants. He's drove for 4 years with no tax, no MOT, no insurance, and he's not been stopped
Sure.
because he's done something. Now I don't know quite what he's done because obviously it's you can't learn what that is in an hour, but I can understand the brief concept.
Yeah.
That's why I think what you're talking about being that freedom of all aspects. That means nobody's got any presumptions on you whatsoever. And if there is a claim and you address that claim, it's easily dealt with. And I think
Yeah.
that's
Well, of
what the
course.
free man of the land was trying to do. Because if you want to understand it with just common sense and logic, the free man of the land jurisdiction actually just separates it perfectly well. But as you said, once you understand that and then you enter back into that jurisdiction, you're just
Yeah.
doubling down on yourself.
Well, yeah.
You've you're
See,
basically becoming adversarial to
right, exactly.
yourself, to your own
Well, exactly.
position.
And that's where that maxim, he who leaves the battlefield first wins. And we all
Yeah,
thought doing commerce that we were winning by perfecting the
yeah.
non-judicial administrative process.
We were
But
playing for the game.
here's the trick and the hook. You're in a field of battle, which means you're in war, which means that if you you know, engage the other side in anything that constitutes an act of war. And what has now been created over all this time, hundreds of years in perfecting their system, is the commercial instruments that you think are your solution are implements of war. You are using a instrument of war to settle something, and therefore you're in a battlefield, and basically you think you can force them to leave the battlefield first, but they don't. And yeah, in some instances, like you said, if they're clogging up the courts and ultimately the people do have the ultimate power of turning this over, because if
Yes,
enough people step out of the
yeah,
fear and start really knowing who they are, what they are, and so forth, yeah, but it requires education, not
yes. It is.
happenstance, not getting something off the internet or somebody says,
Tell me
just do
about it.
this and throw this spaghetti against the wall and see what sticks. You have to understand who you are, where you are, and how to navigate the waters of commerce to get on the land. So
Well,
let me take it to the next step. So once the Domesday Book was created and the census of the land and the land um, control structure of the landed estates that eventually was perfected under the Vatican and the Holy Alliance and basically giving John in 1213 giving the Pope all right title and interest to his estate, which was the kingdom. Now the Vatican had two of the three tiers of its crown. And essentially, it was constructed to be ultimately a two-tiered system of estates. The landed estates, where the land was controlled by the landlords who issued or engaged with the sovereign a oath of fealty, which means an oath of loyalty, that basically was a reciprocal agreement. I accept the grant of land made patent by the crown, by the sovereign, and by the Pope.
Yeah.
In exchange, like any other contract, mutual consideration, et cetera, et cetera. In exchange, I stand loyal to the crown and will bring my men and arms or tithes or taxes or whatever um, to the crown, to the treasury, to defend the kingdom, to defend the land. The second tier was basically the landless serfs or the peasants who had no standing. They might be given limited standing, like a life in life, an estate in life or an estate in terms, things like that. Eventually, this evolved to where um, every person, every living being who's attached to a fictional person is considered a decedent estate. So there's a lot of people out there saying just claim your estate, but they're not claiming the right estate. There are two estates. There's the
Yeah.
public estate, which is a decedent, and in the
Yeah.
IRS, what is defined as a decedent estate is not a deceased person, but in true law dictionary, a decedent is in the state of dying. So we're in a state of dying in a system of death, in a cult of death that goes back to esoterica and Egypt and many other elements back then that have
We refer over here to it as lost at sea in the maritime law, that they're
that's
keeping control and hold of our assets until we
yeah.
come and declare ourselves back.
Right. Well, this lost at sea comes from the SCKV Act of 1666, and it has to do with a SSKV, meaning the man who holds the title is a landed estate by which the duration of that estate is measured. So when he dies, the estate has to go to the the next STKV, the firstborn son, or whomever is first in line if that son is not around. So if a man assessed to KV is lost at sea, then the administrators of the estate must settle that estate and must bring a claim of um, uh, deceased status or death after seven
Yeah.
years, that the
Yeah.
estate goes to the administrators who are the
Yes.
default um,
Yes.
executors of the estate. So what happens when a new baby is born and then is informed, put into form, loses the substance of being and equity, goes into form, must operate in the fictional realm in form. That's why everything is forms. It puts your signature on it. That
Yeah.
that if the estate is abandoned, the true underlying estate, it's abandoned, and therefore the baby becomes a ward of the state and never claims that estate. The true underlying estate, not the decedent estate. So it's a two-level structure of estates. And so Parliament was appointed as the trustee of the infant estates. And the four inns of court, the basis of the bar system and the structure of law that the British Empire expanded throughout the world. And remember, British, is Britannia. It's a Roman district. It's not England. And then they, of course, they incorporated it, and they created the UK, United Kingdom, and they brought Scotland in, which basically was conquered and then became part of the corporate state. And then they bring Ireland in, they split Ireland, they create Northern Ireland, all that stuff, again, to create conflict, Protestants against Catholics, all the rest of it. But essentially, the bottom line is Parliament and all the parliaments in every colony that became part of the Commonwealth, they're all essentially issuing rules for the management of infant estates. When
Mm.
you're attached as a bonded surety to, you're still there because your picture froze.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay. All right. Well, your picture is frozen.
Well,
Okay. But you can hear me.
I'm moving this end.
Okay. There you
I don't
go.
know what's going on.
Okay. You came back. So, so the worldwide system through the Commonwealth, and it has to be understood that America is now part of the Commonwealth. There's certain things that were put in place in the 1770s through 90s and ever since.
Yeah.
But it's all a matter of basically managing infant estates. It goes back to the Domesday Book, and everything was put in place afterwards. And Parliament, aka Congress, makes the rules to manage the commercial bondage or the commercial paper, along with the military to enforce it through the Third
Yes.
Crown, DC, to manage what's managed or implemented through the four Inns of Court in the City of London as the enforcers through the law form of what Parliament issues as the rules for managing infant estates. So that's the actual structure. So if you do not do the proper and complete steps to claim the abandoned estate, and is in effect fulfill Section 4 of the 1666 Cesta KV Act, which says a man who's lost at sea or Cesta KV, who's gone to sea, doesn't return, the estate reverts to the administrators who are going to administrate and settle the any claims, liabilities, and obligations of the estate so that it can be passed on to the new Sesta KV. And that's how the fulfillment of the Unum Sanctum 1302, claiming all the land and the flesh and the blood, really was put into effect. The ultimate goal of all of this was not to create money, not to be rich, not to create all this property ownership. It was to own, quote unquote, by legal mechanisms and mechanics, own and control the genetics of the living flesh of the living beings. That's what the jab was about. That's what the
Yeah.
mRNA is about. The corporate patents on that is to get a contractual nexus to claim. And the genetics, a newborn baby has nothing. He or she is naked and
Yeah.
has nothing except the ancestral lineage that's in the genetics. And that's the living library of a living being that they ultimately want to own and control. Okay.
Well, the
But
Supreme Court's recognised a third person, haven't they? Male, female, and other, because of those genetics that have been changed. Because if I inject you with something and I change your genetics, I
right,
can patent that and
right,
I own you.
right.
That's right. Yeah.
So there's ways to deal with that physically and physiologically to detox all of that. But if you don't deal with it legally and lawfully and
Yeah.
equitably, and the only way you can deal with it is having the standing to state a claim and basically sever the attachment to the obligations of the franchise, the public person, and basically stand in honor, in equity, to settle all claims, contingent and perfected liabilities against that person that previous to your claim of the estate actually was a legally um, valid obligation against the surety. That's where suretyship, which is ultimately insurance or assurance, underwriting the cargo in the hull of a ship, that's where it all
Mhm.
comes in terms of maritime and admiralty law. And when it gets down to bankruptcy, because the franchise we are licensed to operate within the public commercial system is operating, is created, and it's operated under the rules of bankruptcy. And bankruptcy is a issue of admiralty law. Okay, so that's where it brings
Yeah.
in admiralty and maritime. Admiralty law takes control of an estate when it's bankrupt, and in that control establishes rules of management as an executor, as the default executor of that estate. And those rules are defined as civil code. Civil code is Roman civil code, and Roman civil code or civil law is the law of the management of a conquered territory and people. Okay. So when you talk about Mr., well, Mr. has a legal connotation of a surname, and a surname was established by the Napoleonic Code, which was a rewriting of, again, by a French Catholic emperor, Napoleon, who perfected the Napoleonic Code in 1804. And and that was the new restatement of Roman civil law that previously was called the Justinian law, and it had to do
Yeah.
with, Justinian deception and all of that language, Roman language and stuff. But it was with the Napoleonic Code that the surname was required. Previous to that, the titles of a Sir had to do with titles of nobility and landed gentry or entitled claim of the land through the land patent and, the landed
Yeah.
estates. The landless peasants did not have surnames. So the implementation of the Napoleonic Code to have a requirement that everybody has a surname, and that surname was Smith and Jones because, Smith was called Smith because he was a smithy, he was a blacksmith or whatever, in all the ways that surnames were created. So when you say I'm a Mister, or they refer to you as a Mister in court, Mr. Webster, that is it's actually attached to deep esoteric structures because the word stir, S-T-E-R, is a Latin root going back to the Egyptian linguistics of the word that we call star. And so you basically are saying you are one of the stars in the panoply of the heavens that's controlled by the goddess of the stars, who was known as Isis. And the depths of these layers are so deep of where it all goes. And it has to do with the enclosure that we're in, that is referred to in the Bible as the firmament and the waters above, waters below, and it's all about waters, maritime law, admiralty, and so forth. So this is what I've studied for 35 years, built on the previous 35 years of my life, studying esoterica since I was 4 or 5 years old, and many, many things, and ultimately seeing when I got into law how it all was constructed. It took me, I'm going to be 72 in a couple of weeks. It took me 68 of those 72 years to put it all together and see how we're in this incredibly vast, complex hologram of a projected reality that we are actually creating. We are the co-creators with creation, whether you call it God or the creator or just universe creator. We are co-creators in a creational field that has been parasitically overtaken and inserted this false overlay reality that we have allowed ourselves to contract to and into to basically play out and outpicture their false narrative. And we have the power because we are truly in that capacity of creation. They are not, they're parasites. Parasite
Yeah.
only knows how to
I
mimic
know.
and reflect and create a mirror of its host, whether that's biologically or legally or religiously or what have you, and
Or
get
all the above.
well, certainly all the above, and get us to contract with it. And the reason contract is paramount is because we actually, in this universe we're in a universe where the foundational principle, what you call God's law, universal principle, is that all living expression of creation in this universe is endowed with sovereign free will. We have free will, and the entire world system is structured to get us to voluntarily consent to contract. This is again where they hid something like the maxims of commerce, where they hid the fact that you're in a battlefield when you're using their pieces of paper. That's why they refer to paper terrorism, because you contractually obligated yourself to the rules of the parliamentary procedure for managing infant estates. Your parents abandoned your estate, your living estate, which means they gave over your genetics, your ancestral lineage, and everything that is who you are in this embodied form. And unless you properly, timely, and perfected your claim of standing of that estate, which includes your body, then you are subject to those contractual obligations that you entered into because you asserted or utilized your sovereign free will to enter into those contracts. That's why the U.S. Constitution, or the Constitution for the United States of America, originally said that in Article 1, no state has the capacity or the right or authority to impair the obligations of contracts. They use that against us because we've entered into contracts. We use it for our purposes to correct the status of a bonded surety against the bankrupt franchise to reestablish proper contractual relationships. And what we have to do is we have to, in equity, because in equity we have maxims that are really truly principles of universal law. There's 20 primary maxims of equity, and when you study them and start applying them both to your life and issues of law, estates, trusts, and things like that, that in equity, one of the maxims says, in order to receive equity, you must do equity, meaning
Yeah,
that both parties have equitable standing when there's equities involved.
yeah,
When the chancellor or the Court of Chancery recognizes the equities on both sides of um, an issue brought forward to the court by a bill in equity, that you can't see in commerce, you can say, well, Your Honor, I paid this 25-year mortgage, 24 years and 11 months, but I just ran out of money. I can't make that last payment. But don't I get the equity of everything I paid in? I've done the maintenance, I've paid the mortgage, I've done the insurance and mowed the lawn and everything. And the judge says, no, according to this contract, you defaulted. He gets it all. That's commercial law. That's bankruptcy under Admiralty Civil Code and rules. In equity, you must do equity in order to receive equity. You must honor the equity of the other party. So when you sever the attachment to the obligations of the franchise by proper steps, and you correct your status from bonded surety to a true living man or woman on the land
yeah,
with standing to state a claim, you must
yeah,
honor the obligation of the franchise that you operated in their sandbox. Their rules, their sandbox, you have to settle and close. You must um, sever the attachment and close the presumption of consent, because in a free will universe, only contracts are valid with proper mutual consent. So there's another hidden thing that everybody runs the up the flagpole, the Declaration of Independence. Isn't this a great and fabulous document? We declared ourselves free and independent states and all the rest of it. But
yeah,
there's another sentence in there that everybody thinks is the sentence that gives us freedom. Just like in commerce, we thought he who leaves the battlefield first loses. Uh, but that put us in the rules of war. Okay. And then we will always lose because they control the implements of war and they can, in their sandbox, um, prosecute, indict, and convict you of paper terrorism because you're using their commercial paper against them and the rules that you agreed to follow as a driver in commerce of your commercial vessel on the Sea of Commerce and all the rest of it. So in the Declaration of Independence, where's the hook? Where's the feedback back to them controlling? The hook is the sentence that says, or the phrase in a sentence, government by the consent of the governed.
Yeah.
Okay. And everybody in the freedom movement for the last 35 years that I've been interacting with says, yeah, it says Declaration of Independence, we're free and independent. And it says only by the consent. Well, guess what?
You've
Everything you've
consented.
done every single day of your life, you have consented to their form of government. So you
Somebody
have to,
said to me once, Ken, somebody says, you keep saying that your tax is voluntary. They take it before I get my money. How is that voluntary? I went, you used your national insurance number to get that job. He went, well, you have to. I went, I know.
yeah.
So good,
But
good.
you
Yeah,
also use their private military script. Because in bankruptcy, under Roman Civil Code, they have to, and under international law, if you look at something called the Convention at The Hague, 1907, that established the rules of war on land, because see, all war is maritime. It comes
yeah,
from the god Mars, which is maritime. Okay. Everything is maritime. Everything is in the sea. That's why they call the Pope sits on what? The Holy Seat, which is called the Seatus Sanctum. And it's called
yeah.
the Holy See, which stands for Cetus, which is the seat, which is supposedly of Peter, but it goes way back further into Egypt and their whole
I have to
pantheon.
say, mate, I have to say, Ken, Peter, for me, has nothing to do with the Catholic Church, only by name. What I've
Yeah,
seen that what I've seen that institution do is Luciferian.
of course. It's all
Nothing to do
about
with
that. It's definitely about that. Um, so, but anyways, when you're in admiralty bankruptcy and under Roman rules of civil code and all the rest of it, that you are using private script, and who is the enforcer of the bankruptcy to make sure the protection of the interests of the creditor are preserved? It's the military, or Washington, D.C., and the United States military. So DC is the third crown that controls the commerce that bonds and puts into bondage through the commercial paper and all of that. The people turns them into persons, turns them into bonded surety that under license as a driver in commerce, they must use the all the pieces of the system, including the script that we call
yeah,
money, to buy and sell, to do everything that we do. So when you bind that to a social insurance number, which is insurance, which takes us back to maritime, the insurance that's underwriting the commercial script that's called money, whether pounds, euros, dollars, and all the rest of it, then you're playing by their rules. And so you have to really know where you are, who you are, and how to properly remove the presumption of consent, sever the obligations, enter equity, do the claim of the estate, properly perfect it, return yourself to the position of the executor of your own estate, not the default state in all capital letters that uses
yeah,
its entire bureaucracy to implement the parliamentary rules of the management as trustee of the infant estates, that when you do something wrong against their codes, you get an attorney who is an officer of the four inns of court to turn you in to a rabbinical three rabbi tribunal, basically. And the three rabbis are basically the guy or the lady in the black robe, the prosecutor who represents the interests of the creditor of the state, and basically you as the bonded surety. So you're in a three rabbinical court, but see, you can't represent yourself because you are impaired. You have no standing or status.
yeah,
So the third part representing the debtor is the third attorney, the defendant attorney, who has his primary oath to the court in the inns of court through the bar. And you're just basically there as the inventoried collateral to settle the claim. All
yeah.
claims are commercial.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so you must settle the
Understand.
commercial claims.
Consent.
So people who are saying, well, I'm doing equity and I'm doing my estate, blah, 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 they still don't understand the dual layered nature of what's the decedent estate and what's the land, the essentially the ancestral state. Our living body is the landed estate. Who is the um, true being in the landed estate?
Mm.
We are. Okay. This is the real landed estate, not their false projection of these titled barons and princes and dukes and all that. We are the true landed estate. We are the true beings that have the power and the authority, but we've contracted it away by consent of their government. So, but we don't want to go to war. We don't want to go to battle. The minute you start using their commercial paper, you are in the field of battle and they control all the cards there. So
Yeah.
understanding your use of the voucher on the bill, the gas bill, the utility bill, that's a bond. The utility bill is authorized by license, just as the bank is, the finance company, and all the rest of it, to issue bonds, which are debt instruments against the underlying trust, which is the vital statistics account that is the decedent estate that's controlled by the state as the default executor that you abandoned because your parents abandoned it. They went from lawful parents to legal guardians and you never properly claimed that estate and gave them notice and set them up as a true trustee of a living being who is in control of
Yeah.
his or her estate as the true executor and
Yeah.
preserving the beneficial rights and the equitable interests and settling all claims against the franchise that you were formerly the bonded surety. So
Yeah. So if that had been recognised, that signature, that endorsement of that instrument, it would have just gone straight through.
well, yes and no. But since the utility bill is a bond, you look at a bond, it's called a coupon bond. A coupon bond, if you look up, do a search on the internet, just say coupon bonds. What are they? You will see that before everything became electrified, electronic,
Yeah.
that bonds were issued against corporations or any valid entity that can issue a debt instrument. It was as a bond. And there were two kinds of bonds, either a original discount bond that had no coupon, and basically it was like wartime bonds. In World War II, they issued US war bonds, and they would issue them in a denomination of face value, like say $5,000, but you would pay $3,300 for it. You'd actually buy it for 33. It would have a maturing rate, say over whatever the time, 5 years. And every year the interest would accrue. So your $3,300 purchase a year later would become worth, say, 3,600 and then 3,900 or 4,000 until it reached its maturity rate or date. Now it's worth full value of the face value of the bond. That's called an original issue discounted bond. The other kind of bond is called a coupon bond. A coupon bond is where you pay face value, $5,000, and it has all these coupons for whatever the time of the bond is, the obligation. So, you can, a municipality can issue a coupon bond and say it'll pay quarterly interest for the next 5 years. You pay full value for the face value and you tear a coupon off each time you send it in, you redeem the interest, and they send you back a check for that interest. Okay, so you've exchanged one essentially negotiable instrument, the coupon. They exchange it for a check that they send back to you. You go to the bank and you put it in the bank. Okay. So all bills are actually coupon bonds. The bottom third is the voucher that is the interest of the bond that is a debt against the franchise. Okay, so they're creating a monetary debt issue that's underwritten by the private equity of the estate and their license as a utility provider to issue these bonds that you take as a bill that you have to pay with public debt. So you are double paying. And what does the voucher, the receipt at the bottom always say? Return this receipt with your payment. Okay.
Well, that was the interesting thing with my joint gyros. It was saying things like no payment payable at post office, meaning I wasn't to pay it. I was to endorse it. So in our system, we
Right.
have two instruments. We have two negotiable instruments. They call both instruments bank gyro credits. The difference between the two instruments is one has funds already attached that needs to be released to my agent, which is the utility company acting as an agent for a creditor. So my utility company always treated me as a creditor, but they wanted me to pay because they always sent me the correct instrument. And the
Mhm.
difference was it had Trans Cash, a logo on it called Trans Cash. So my endorsement now allowed my utility company to access the commercial bank account, gas account for me. It's my account. They can't get it without my endorsement. So as a creditor, I knew they were sending me this. No, I weren't, kind of with my head cocked to one side. You think this should work. This should go straight through because I've seen it happen with Marks and Spencer's credit cards. We've had results with setting off credit cards. So I said this should just go straight through, and they told me they've got the gyro, but they haven't received the payment. So I ended up speaking with Centrica, who is the owner of British Gas, and Centrica knew who I was. Never spoke to him before in my life,
Mm.
Ken. But they knew who I was. As soon as I told them who I was, oh, everybody's heard of you, Mr. Webster. I'm going,
Yeah.
and they wouldn't put me through to the legal department. Would I ring back? Now, the same fella was totally different towards me. Oh, good news, Mr. Webster. I've spoken with legal on your behalf and they're going to be in touch. Now, that was June 2014. That was it. So, and what I had was I don't know what the different what the because it's a debt-based economy. I don't know what instruments you would have over there, or the same as Australia or Canada, but there must be something similar now because of that digital stuff. I remember in round about the mid 90s, British Gas got done for double dipping. So people were signing a £200 check voucher. It's basically a check back to them, sign it for 200 quid and then put in 200 quid cash. So they're getting paid 400 quid. It was just unreal to look back on that. And then all of a sudden it was go direct debit and we'll knock you a tenner off your
Right.
bill.
Right.
So it was like it was that bait pulling people in because once you went direct debit, Ken, you never see another paper bill.
Of
You'll never
course.
see that. Well, I always got the instrument, and then all of a sudden they sent us just bank gyros. Well, the difference with a bank gyro is it's the same type of instrument saying this account needs money, that amount paying into this account. That's all that instrument does. I have to put funds to that, but with mine, I didn't. So in 2019, Santander, who is our commercial bank over here, said we're not going to issue any more joint gyro credits for utilities. Now, when I said about when I signed it, if I'd have been recognised, they would have accepted it. Was I not being adversary to myself by just signing it because they wanted the signature? But once I'd signed it and said, well, I've paid you, I've settled it, then they have to rebut me because otherwise the cash cow's gone.
Yeah, of
So I
course.
thought if we'd have got enough back then, we could have done something. And like I said, there's more people wanting to do it now, but they would have to go and sue for that instrument. For me, Ken, it's always been about what's the simplest. If I'm recognised as a man, nobody touches me unless I've gone into that. When it's all presumption, bloody hell, you could presume everything. And if I don't rebut everything, I'm still under that contract. That's amazing. That's when you see in history, give me control of the kids. Give me the kids, I'll give you the nation.
Of course. Of course.
Wow.
Okay, well, you know what? We've been going 2 hours and 30 or 40
Yeah, two and a
minutes.
half. Yeah, yeah.
And I think we've covered a lot. What I'd like to
Enjoyed the
do,
conversation.
thank you. What I'd like to do is invite you and anybody else um, in the Western Isles to really come and have a look at PanTerra. It's called PanTerra Vida. We originally started as PanTerra de Oro, or the Golden Panther, the Panther of the gold. We changed it to Vida because we're about life. It's all about walking into life, walking out of the false
Yes.
illusions of the Matrix. And
Come out of her, my people.
yeah, exactly. It's all that. And so I'd invite you and anybody else watching or the people you're associated with to have a look at what PanTerra Vida is, because everything I've touched on in 2.5 hours is really, in a lot of ways, just scratching the surface, covering a lot of very key points. There's been a very unique conversation of the way I've described things and linked all the various elements. But there's depth in our education on our online university, which is called gem.university, or that's the website address. But over the last 30 years, going back to what I said, I saw in all the things in the 90s and onward that there was no continuity and there was no interactive structure with guidance and really filling in and answering the questions. So that compelled me to formulate what would a structure be like to put in place that continuity so that people could really learn this to the core of it, to the hard rock and the depth. And so in my journey with the people in the 90s and into the 2000s, one of the things I learned was the origin of what now was converted to a nation state under the Law of Nations that came out in the 1750s through 70s, eventually underwrote the purpose and reason or the justification for the League of Nations, United Nations. It's all to create estates and to create bonded
Yeah.
sureties of all the
Yeah.
bondage and all of that.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, what came out of the City of London in the 1500s was the true lawful and recognized basis of what the nation states were put upon, which is a society. And you
Yeah.
go into the Law of Nations, the first thing it says is a society is a group of men, obviously just men at that time, with a like-minded purpose and intention. That's all it is. And it
Yeah.
comes out of the City of London. It underwrites the corporations, the fraternities, the guilds, the fishmongers, and the leather workers. And this is the basis of everything that grew in the next 500 years to the containment structure of nations that were then put into bankruptcy and everything we've talked to. So we
To the point,
created.
Ken, where we had to go to we in this country we had to go to Supreme Court to define what a woman was.
Well, I
That's
know,
what
but
all
see,
this has done for 500
that's
years.
all their legalistic linguistic bullshit that they control. The Supreme Court is not a lawful body. It's a corporate entity that's adjudicating the parliamentary rules of Roman civil law in bankruptcy and the management of infant estates. So when you have an attorney can only represent an infant, an imbecile, or a incompetent.
Yeah,
And so
yeah,
anybody who has an attorney in their court is immediately recognized
turned
as
up.
an infant, an imbecile, and an incompetent. And you've been
Yeah,
turned into basically their cult of death.
yeah.
So in conclusion, I just want to invite people to come have a look at what we're doing. The way to do that is you subscribe through Patreon or Substack to Freedom Absolute. And you have to be a paid subscriber. When you do that, then you have access. You can enroll and enter into GEM University as what we call a GEM member, which is General Education Membership. And there's a lot of fundamental building blocks, foundational knowledge, teaching about all the levels of types of jurisdiction, a lot of history, a lot of esoterica, and then the specifics of trust law, equity, estates, all the things we've touched on here. That builds a foundation of a knowledge base that, as far as I'm concerned, in all due humility, supersedes everything that's out there in the internet because there's too many conflicting things out there, and it doesn't address the core level of how this has all been put together. So with that knowledge, like you said, bring my people out. The lack of knowledge is what bonds the people. The knowledge that we have built over the last 15 years in Gemstone University, now called Gem University, builds that foundation of knowledge that then can be implemented through our master law course, which has three component parts: an undergraduate that goes more extensively into equity, trust law, estate law, all the things you need to know to really integrate what I've talked about in this conversation. And then we go to estate structure. Our society, PanTerra, has been recognized by the public as a valid private jurisdiction because all societies have the absolute right, because this is what they do with their nation states, to have its own jurisdiction, its own law form, its own court, its own treasury, its own monetary issue if it chooses out of its bona fide reserves of its treasury, and how to set up relationships interconnected, society to society. So our estate structure walks people through what I have done in the last 30 years of moving from the bondage to the public estate, the decedent, the dying estate, to a private estate. And in the rules of this world, all property is titled to an estate, whether it's a landed estate, a titled estate, or a decedent estate owned by the state, or we have the right and capacity when we have the standing to create our own society, our own estate, and bring our title and property and assets and interests into that private estate. This is how PanTerra has been built for 30 years. We've had attempts of intrusion. I've had the IRS, the SEC, the FBI have all come knocking, and I have properly and lawfully said, thank you, but you have no jurisdiction, and they went away. So this is what we teach in the undergraduate course, and then start implementing it in the state structure and ultimately status correction. To do all those things, to remove the presumption of consent, to sever the attachment as the bonded surety, and to truly and properly, lawfully, that must be recognized legally as a true living man with that standing. So I would really like to see you come in and start putting those pieces together, because you have so much of the pieces, and I'm sure you already do, but I will say that if you look at your life circumstance, that this is what you came into this life to achieve, is to really become a pioneer or a trailblazer to open this up. And the only way that was going to happen is if you got whacked on the head the way you got whacked with all the things that you had to go through. And many people who've really come through it, whether it's tax issues, court issues, or what have you, that's our story. We had to do that in order to kick our ass out of the comfort zone of just saying, hey, well, it's a nice little domestic sandbox. And if I do all the right things and follow the rules, then they're going to give me my pieces of paper to buy my loaf of bread.
Yeah.
But ultimately, as we can see unfolding now in the last 5 to 8 years, they don't care about that. They don't care about the money. They don't even care about the power. The God that they bow down to
Yeah.
is one that wants one thing: the living library of the genetic code that they are now intently after. And we have to make that stand to say, no, we do not consent, and know how to stand on that. So that's what we do.
I'm
And
certainly going to be looking further into this because it's coming out of CPTSD now. I mean, it's like I said, I'm only just now getting my processes back. But for a long time, the flame was really, it was really dampened down over the last 5 years since I can't even say losing my job, Ken. I was forced, I was bullied out of my job for government policies that couldn't be implemented. It was ridiculous. Where I was asked to leave healthcare, what I was detailed for, because the auditor would go around and score them down because I'm there not wearing a mask. So when I went the other side of the gate and the healthcare manager says, "Thanks, Webby," I went, "It's no problem. When I come back and you're fighting with a prisoner there, I'll stay 6 feet away from you because of COVID." "Oh, don't be like that." "No, we can't keep having it all these ways." So that took me right back to armed police. I've had in these battles. I know you said don't that we're going to war here. The factor was I had to find out, like you said about getting smacked up me side of my face. I had to find out that I was at war. That even though I can see that I've clearly got a remedy here, you've said I've got a remedy here. What's happening? What am I missing?
Well, what you
This
were
is where
missing
I
is you didn't have the standing to implement the remedy.
This is,
Okay,
but nobody would know that then. We knew that there was a standing for a living man, but we didn't know how to implement it.
right.
So we were all trying to work and at the
Of
same time
course.
as
Yeah.
doing. That was
Yeah.
the difficult part.
So we do have a small group of members of PanTerra in the Western Isles. I don't like to call it UK or even Britain,
Mm,
but basically we call them the Verdant Isles, the Green Isles. And so we have a group of members there who've been steadily studying. It's not very big. We've gone through our own purging and cleansing many phases. But anyway, so Rob, who you met, and his wife Jen, and some other members have really established a grounding point and are connected to what we're doing on a worldwide level. So check in with Rob and
yeah, I will
pursue
do.
it there. Our websites are, as I said, gem.university, PanTerra Vida, that's PanTerravida.org,
Yeah,
and also ptvcourt.org, where our notices, our law form, our court structure, it's basically an integrated whole system of how we could properly and lawfully establish new forms of self-governance and really step above the matrix, walk out of it.
yeah,
And
yeah.
and this is
It
what we're here to do.
makes perfect sense to me. What I'm going to do is I'll get in touch with Rob and I'll ask Rob to come on the podcast,
Okay.
and he can give a much better overview than what I can from a few
Well,
hours soaking.
Rob is pretty new, so he may be missing a lot of
Well, maybe
the
Rob can put me in touch with someone
Yeah,
in
yeah,
the
there is
UK that is
somebody
a bit
else. There are
more
some
open.
people. Yeah, it'd be better. I mean, I don't mind Rob doing that, but he can talk from his point of view of what he's been experiencing. He probably told you he's got some weird stuff going on with same thing, corporate,
Yeah,
police, judicial. He's
yeah,
just learning how to deal with it. So, but he is pretty much of a newly arrived member.
yeah.
Um,
He did say that. I mean, me and Rob must have talked for about 4 hours,
Yeah,
Ken.
yeah.
So I'll speak to him. I'll see if
Well,
there's
yeah, definitely
anybody.
don't exclude them from. I'm just saying
No,
that
no.
if you do the podcast, have one or two others of the members of Pantera who've
That's what
been
I was going to
there.
suggest.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to suggest that because I've got, like I said, the lad I've spoke to today. He's doing a talk over in Hull this weekend, um, and then I think he's going to come and do a talk up at where I did a talk as well. But
Hey,
I'll
hang on
invite.
one
He's
second.
coming up
Where did you say he's doing the talk?
in Hull
Okay. Do you know
in
why it's
England.
called Hull?
No,
All right. So we're talking about maritime. We're talking about cargo. In where? Where does cargo get carried?
in the hold. In
Hull,
the hold. Yeah,
Hull, the
yeah,
hull
yeah,
of the
yeah.
ship.
Makes sense.
What is done with that cargo? It is underwritten by insurance to underwrite and assure the safety of the delivery from one
Yes,
port to the other.
yes,
And when it goes
yeah,
from sea to land, the port master receives the vessel in order to either
yes,
allow it to pass or take a claim against the cargo held in the hull. So
yeah,
Hull, England has a corresponding hull in Quebec, a city called Hull. This is where, when a baby is born and the documents are created and the registration goes from local to state to national, it's all sent to Hull, Quebec for North America, Hull, England for you and probably all the Commonwealth. That's where all the papers held as cargo in the ship for
That's
underwriting,
interesting.
insurance, and settlement of claims. All the judicial, everything we've been talking about are commercial settlements of claims against the injured cargo in the hull of a ship that's been underwritten by insurance to carry from port to port. When you're taken
Amazing.
into a court, there is in every courthouse a portmaster who is representing the entry point of the cargo from sea to land. And when they adjudicate a claim in commerce for a fine or imprisonment, that's the settlement against the surety, which is the living body that they're going to take as either the surety or the debt performer, debt servicer, or inventory in a ward of the state as a warden in a prison. You worked as a prison officer under who? A warden. What was he doing? He was managing the inventory of the wards of the state who had been adjudicated for a claim against the cargo, which was the paper that was held in Hull, UK and Hull, Quebec. So that's interesting.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That is interesting. Thank you for that information. That joins a few more dots because whereas you describe yourself as a puzzle master, I describe myself as a pattern recognizer. I
Hmm.
see patterns. I've always seen patterns, and when I saw all these patterns on all these layers, going back to biblical stuff, that whether it doesn't matter whether people believe or not, these people believe demons and fallen angels, all these entities, all these sacrifices that have always been done, and it's the same system. It's always been the same system. So, yeah, I'm definitely looking for remedy. This lad's going to be coming on to show us what he did. He reckons within 6 weeks with his process, you can now get, and he's gone like you, he's gone through hell to get to this. He's got his sealed documents from the court. He's banned from every court in England and Scotland. He can't enter a courtroom in this
Mm.
country. So it's going to be interesting to get him on to tell his
Yeah.
story.
Yeah, I'd
But
like to hear
I'll
that.
speak to Rob. I'll speak to Rob through the week, and then arrange a brief conversation. See whether we can sort a day he can come on, and then bring somebody who Rob communicates with, who's more savvy, because I know Rob said to me, he says, I'm getting quite savvy with it, but I'm still quite, new to
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
But I'm sure he must be speaking to people who will be willing to come on and fill in the gaps that he
Sure.
can't fill. So
For sure.
thanks for the time, Ken. It's been a
Thank
really
you.
interesting conversation.
Good. And
Thank you very much, sir.
someday I'd be happy to come on your podcast too, and we can continue the
I'd love to
conversation.
have you on there anytime.
Okay.
Anytime you're ready.
And or also do these Zoom recordings, which we are going to we'll put this up on the Freedom Absolute YouTube and
Okay,
Rumble, and we'll send you the link and you can pass that around for your people to
definitely.
come listen to. Okay.
Definitely. I'll even broadcast it.
Sounds good. Okay. All right. Thanks a
Thanks a
lot,
lot,
Paul.
Ken. Take care, my friend.
Okay.
Night. God bless.
Bye-bye.